April 5th, 1944, 2:30 a.m., Western Pacific Ocean, aboard the battleship USS Missouri. The breath of the Pacific was a constant, damp and salty slap. It seeped through every steel crevice, every poorly latched hatch, carrying with it the scent of fuel, sweat, and that particular melancholy of the open sea. At this hour, the deck, a 58,000-ton behemoth, was merely a dark silhouette, swallowed by a starless gloom. The moon, if it existed, was hidden behind a dense blanket of low clouds that promised more than just rain. They promised isolation. Only the dull, constant roar of the steel beast's engines broke the silence, a perpetual vibration that resonated in one's bones, in one's very soul. Below, in the 'tween decks, the air was thick, heavy. The tropical heat clung to the skin, an invisible, persistent enemy. The only light came from yellowish bulbs that flickered with a weariness similar to that of the men who slept, or tried to sleep, stacked in their bunks. Some insomniac stared at the metallic ceiling, seeing not the steel, but the months, the years that had blurred into this floating hell. Tension was another companion, silent but ever present, a tight knot in the stomach of every sailor, waiting for what? No one knew for sure, but the feeling was tangible, like the metallic taste of blood in one's mouth after a blow. The USS Missouri, the mighty Mo, was a marvel of naval engineering. Her 16-inch guns could spit death 20 miles away. Her armor was a floating fortress. She had been conceived for glory, for battle, to be the pinnacle of American naval might. And she was. She was America's promise in steel, a symbol of unwavering determination. She wasn't just a machine. She was a home, a prison, a battlefield. For the nearly 3,000 men aboard, the Missouri was their entire world. But the pride of the steel couldn't extinguish the fire burning within her entrails. Not the fire of the boilers, but that of frustration, of resentment. The war had turned them into shadows of their former selves, months, almost a year, without setting foot on solid ground, without seeing a familiar face other than that of another exhausted sailor. The mighty Mo was an invincible colossal, yes, but her insides were a hell of stifling heat, monotonous rations and a discipline that bordered on tyranny. Morale was slowly bleeding away, drop by drop, like an internal wound no one saw but everyone felt. Shore leave, a distant promise at the start of their service, had vanished like smoke on the sea breeze. For many, their wives, their children, their lives before the war were already a blurry memory, almost a dream, the fear not of the Japanese but of oblivion, of losing themselves, began to corrode them. In that steel belly, hierarchy was unbreakable law. Officers with their immaculate uniforms and privileges seemed to live in a parallel dimension. Freshwater showers, fresh food, the relative comfort of their cabins. These contrasted brutally with the conditions of the lower-ranked sailors. Saltwater showers, rations repetitive to the point of nausea, hot, humid bunks. Every small luxury of those above was a thorn embedded in the flesh of those below. Weariness was a predator. Fatigue accumulated muscles in bloodshot eyes. Hours upon hours of watch, of maintenance, of combat drills that never seemed to end. The simple act of staying awake was a daily battle, and shore leave, a mockery. It was spoken of in whispers, as if naming it might bring bad luck. Soon, the officers would say. But soon had become a cruel joke. Soon was another way of saying never. The frustration, repressed for so long, began to fester. Small incidents, heated arguments, defiant glances. The spark was there, waiting for the right wind. Discontent simmered slowly, fueled by exhaustion, by hopelessness. How much more could they endure? How much more could be demanded of them? The USS Missouri, the pride of the fleet, sailed blindly towards an internal storm, a storm of men at their limit, where duty collided head-on with the most basic of human needs, to be treated with dignity. And in the darkness of that early morning, as the Pacific sighed around them, a silent but powerful question began to float in the stale air of the decks. What if the fear of consequences vanished, overcome by the unbearable weight of injustice? April 5th, 1944, 6 a.m., main deck of the USS Missouri. Dawn brought not the relief of light, but a greyish gloom that spread over the ocean like a shroud. The air, far from refreshing, had grown heavier, laden with the sticky humidity of a day that promised to be long and oppressive. On deck, sailors moved like shadows, their actions mechanical, devoid of the vitality a new day should bring. Petty officers' whistles cut through the air, sharp, monotonous orders that barely elicited an automatic response. The smell of stale coffee and burnt oil mingled in the atmosphere, a combination no one consciously registered anymore. It was the scent of routine, the smell of life on the edge. At the bow, a small group of sailors had gathered for breakfast. They didn't speak much, their eyes fixed on nothing, silently chewing hardtack and watery coffee. But amongst them, a whisper, barely audible above the ship's clamour, began to circulate. They were short words, fragmented phrases, yet each was a spark. Leave. Injustice. At breaking point. The conversation, clandestine and furtive, was a slow poison injecting itself into the veins of morale. Amongst the crew, Chief Petty Officer Thomas "Tom" Miller stood out. A man of 35, his face was marked by sun and fatigue, but with a steely gaze that refused to yield. Tom had served in the Navy since before the war, and he had seen it all. He had felt the roar of cannons and the icy fear of waiting, but he had never witnessed such deep, palpable despair as that which now gnawed at his men. He himself was a father of 2 small children, whom he hadn't seen in almost a year and a half. His wife's letters, growing shorter, more distant, were a constant reminder of what they were losing. "We can't go on like this, Tom," whispered young sailor Billy Henderson, barely 20, with sunken eyes. "My mum's poorly. I need to go home, even if it's just for a few days." Billy was the face of vulnerability, a boy disguised as a sailor, his innocence crushed under the yoke of war. His voice trembled not from fear of battle, but from the anguish of powerlessness. Tom observed Billy, then the others. He saw the same exhaustion, the same contained rage. He knew they weren't alone. Discontent was a rising tide threatening to breach the dam of discipline. Rumours from other ships of small acts of disobedience, of refusal to follow orders, circulated through the decks like ghosts. They were distant echoes, but each echo fed the idea that they weren't the only ones feeling the unbearable weight of the situation. The straw that broke the camel's back wasn't a spectacular event, but an accumulation of small humiliations. That very morning, during a routine bunk inspection, Lieutenant Stevens, a young, arrogant officer fresh out of the academy, found a tin of homemade biscuits a sailor's mother had sent from home. Instead of ignoring it, or even allowing the sailor to enjoy them, Stevens, with a contemptuous smirk, tossed them overboard, citing sanitation regulation. The sailor, a 19-year-old named Jimmy O'Connell, was frozen. The humiliation was public, the act deliberate. Jimmy didn't cry, but his eyes burned with a silent fury. Tom Miller saw it, and he saw the reaction of the others. The rage, contained until then, threatened to erupt. In the engine room, the heat was suffocating. Sweat poured down the mechanics' bodies, soaking their overalls. The deafening roar of the turbines was a constant torture. The chief engineer, a burly authoritarian sergeant, had once again denied a relief request from a group of men who had been working for over 12 hours without rest. "The war doesn't wait, you useless lot," he had shouted, with unnecessary brutality. Physical exhaustion joined indignation. The sparks of rebellion began to ignite in the darkest corners of the ship. In the afternoon, the captain's radio broadcast a message from Washington. A minor victory on the Pacific front. The news was met with a thunderous silence among the crew. What good were victories if they remained prisoners on their own ship? The feeling of disconnection between high strategy and the brutal reality of their lives was unbearable. Patriotic speeches, once inspiring, now sounded hollow, almost offensive. The captain of the USS Missouri, Captain Arthur Vance, was a man of iron principles, a veteran of the First World War. He believed in discipline above all else, but his rigidity prevented him from seeing the storm brewing beneath his feet. To him, sailors were cogs in a war machine, not human beings with needs, with families, with limits. His office on the bridge was a sanctuary of order and control, oblivious to the emotional chaos boiling in the depths of the ship. As night fell once more over the Pacific, the mighty Mo continued to cut through the waters, a formidable giant on the outside, but a pressure cooker about to explode within. In the dark bunks, whispers grew more audible, gazes more resolute. The idea, once merely a fleeting thought, began to take shape, to acquire critical mass. Tom Miller met Billy Henderson in a less-travelled corridor. "We can't go on like this, Billy," Tom said, his voice deep and firm. "We have to do something, or there'll be nothing left of us." Billy nodded, his eyes reflecting the same determination burning in Tom's soul. Rebellion, once a concept, was now a necessity, a silent promise between exhausted men. April 6th, 1944. 8 p.m. Deep within the USS Missouri's boiler deck. The air was an industrial furnace, thick with steam and soot, vibrating with the incessant roar of the machinery. It was a place where light barely penetrated, and shadows danced with the battleship's feverish pulse. There, amidst the labyrinth of steaming pipes and boilers that bellowed like caged beasts, Tom Miller met with a handful of trusted men. It wasn't a formal meeting, but a clandestine gathering disguised between the night shift and maintenance rounds. Their faces, bathed in sweat and the reddish glow of the furnaces, were masks of determination and fear. "They've got us cornered," Tom began, his voice barely audible over the engine room's din. "They demand our souls, and don't even give us air to breathe. No more. Enough is enough." Billy Henderson, the young man with the sunken eyes, clenched his fists. Beside them, a burly Irish sailor, Patrick O'Malley, a veteran of 1,000 brawls, both in port and at sea, added, "I've seen tough captains, but this one's killing us inside. And what he did to Jimmy today, that was the last straw." O'Malley had an imposing presence. His loyalty, once earned, was unwavering. He was the muscle, the voice of the men's contained anger. It wasn't the first time a ship had faced the wrath of its crew. Stories of mutinies in naval history were legends, warnings, and sometimes inspirations. The men remembered, or at least had heard, about the Russian sailors of the Potemkin or the Bounty mutineers. Stories of men who, pushed to the limit, had chosen desperation over blind obedience. Martial law was brutal, the consequences unimaginable. But the fear of the gallows or prison wasn't always greater than the fear of losing one's own dignity. As they spoke, their eyes met, seeking and finding the same spark of defiance. The plan began to take shape, rudimentary at first, but with a clear direction: to stop the machinery, refuse to work, and force a negotiation. It wasn't a mutiny to seize the ship, not for violence. It was a strike, a desperate plea, a silent cry. They wanted to be heard. They wanted their leave. They wanted respect. The logistics were a maze. Each crew member had a vital function. Stopping the ship meant coordinating men at different points, from the engine room to the bridge, from the galleys to the guns. Trust was the currency, and fear the silent enemy. Any leak, any betrayal meant a court-martial, and perhaps death. In the infirmary, Medical Corporal Thompson, a middle-aged man with a quiet temperament and deep empathy, observed the increasing number of casualties from stress and exhaustion. These weren't combat wounds, but invisible wounds, no less debilitating. Men with chronic insomnia, stomach ulcers, nervous breakdowns. Thompson, though not directly involved in the conspiracy, felt the ship's pulse. He knew the situation was unsustainable. He himself had tried to intercede several times with the officers, requesting more humane treatment, more rest for the men. His pleas had fallen on deaf ears. "They're sailors, Corporal. They're here to obey," Captain Vance had told him with his usual coldness. Thompson wasn't a coward, but he was a man of peace. The idea of a mutiny churned his stomach. However, he couldn't ignore the humanity of his patients. He felt a duty, not just to the ship, but to the men who manned her. Meanwhile, on the bridge, Captain Vance reviewed the daily reports. All in order. The Missouri, a Swiss watch of steel and fire. No anomalies. No sign of the tempest brewing under his nose. The arrogance of authority, the distance between command and troop, created a fatal blindness. He, like many of his officers, lived in a bubble of privilege and adherence to protocols. The reality of his men's sweat, fear, and desperation was a distant echo, something he didn't need to understand. The night of April 6th was a torment of anxiety for Tom Miller and his men. Every shadow seemed a spy, every creak of steel a betrayer. The decision was made. The following morning, at reveille, when the ship was expected to spring to life with routine, they would refuse. They would stay in their bunks, at their posts, but in silence. They would obey no orders until Captain Vance heard their demands. In his bunk, Tom Miller stared at the metallic ceiling, his mind a whirlwind of possible scenarios. Law, justice, war. Everything blended into a cruel paradox. He wasn't a hero, just a tired man who had seen too much suffering. A man who believed there was a line that couldn't be crossed without losing one's soul. And that line had been crossed. The decision was a monumental weight on his chest, but also a strange liberation. They had chosen. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The mighty Mo continued to cut through the waves, oblivious to the storm brewing within her, a storm of human will, about to defy the power of steel and military authority. April 7th, 1944, 6 a.m., dawn on the USS Missouri. The first ray of sunshine broke through the clouds, painting the horizon a pale orange, and promising a brutally hot day. The ocean, once an expanse of mystery and solitude, now seemed an unforgiving mirror reflecting the palpable tension on board. Reveille sounded, a sharp, piercing whistle that every morning ripped sailors from restless sleep and thrust them into routine. But this morning, something was different. On the lower decks, where hundreds of bunks lined up in endless rows, silence gripped the passageways. There was no usual murmur of voices, nor the metallic clatter of men preparing for their duties. Our boots didn't echo on the steel. The only sound was the constant hum of the ship's machinery and the breathing of men who, with open eyes, lay motionless in their bunks. It was a dense, heavy silence charged with defiance, a silence that screamed. In the engine room, the exhausted night shifts were not relieved. The day shift mechanics, led by Patrick O'Malley, simply failed to appear. The levers, the gauges, the valves, everything remained unattended, the engines roaring alone, like abandoned beasts. In the galley, the personnel stopped preparing breakfast. At their guard posts, some sailors remained in place, but their eyes were fixed on nothing, their hands motionless. It was a silent insurrection, a revolt of inactivity. Tom Miller, at the centre of that whirlwind of stillness, felt the pulse of the mutiny. His gut twisted. There were no gunshots, no blood, but the battle had already begun. The officers at first didn't understand. "Up, you slackers!" petty officers shouted, their voices filled with disbelief. "To your posts or you'll face a court-martial." But the orders were lost in the air, without echo, without response. Lieutenant Stevens, the same man who had thrown Jimmy's biscuits overboard, stormed into one of the berthing compartments. "O'Connell, get up right now," he bellowed. Jimmy, with glassy eyes, remained motionless. Stevens' fury was palpable, but Jimmy didn't stir. It was the first time an officer had been challenged so openly and directly. The image of Stevens shouting at an inert sailor was that of authority stripped of its usual power. News quickly reached the bridge. Captain Vance, a man who lived for order and discipline, received the report with a mix of shock and indignation. "Impossible!" he exclaimed, striking the table. "This is a mutiny, an outrage to the flag and the honour of this ship." His face, normally impassive, was now contorted with rage. He ordered the officers to assemble immediately. "Arrest the ringleaders. Anyone who refuses to obey will be jailed," Vance roared. But his orders were like ripples in water. The petty officers, many of them men who shared the crew's frustration, moved slowly, with palpable reluctance. The chain of command, that unbreakable pillar of naval life, began to crumble. On the main deck, the situation grew tense. A group of sailors, led by Tom Miller and Patrick O'Malley, had gathered at a central point. They didn't speak. They just waited. They waited for the officer's reaction, waiting for the confrontation. Suddenly, the imposing figure of Captain Vance appeared on the bridge, looming over them like an angry deity. His voice, amplified by the loudspeaker system, resonated throughout the ship, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Attention, crew of the USS Missouri, this is grave insubordination. Return to your posts immediately or face the most severe consequences." The echo of his voice faded, and silence returned. But this time, it was a defiant, collective silence. Not a man moved. None broke ranks, only stares, hundreds of eyes fixed on the distant figure of the captain. The tension was unbearable. It was the point of no return. The entire ship was suspended in that instant, in that clash of wills. The mighty Mo, the invincible battleship was paralyzed, not by an enemy attack, but by the contained fury of her own men. The war in the Pacific had found a new battlefield, on the decks of an Allied ship, among those who should have fought together. April 7th, 1944, midday, main deck of the USS Missouri. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the steel deck. The air had become unbearable, yet no one seemed to feel the heat, only the piercing cold of uncertainty. Captain Vance, his face hardened, descended from the bridge, escorted by a handful of loyal officers. His footsteps echoed with an authority that now seemed faltering. He stopped a few meters from the line of sailors, a silent wall of men who, for the first time in a long while, stood firm for something more than an order. Captain Vance and Tom Miller locked eyes. There were no shouts, no threats, only a confrontation of wills. In that moment, the mighty Mo wasn't just a ship. It was the stage for a duel between unyielding duty and human desperation. Medical Corporal Thompson, observing from the infirmary, felt a knot in his stomach. It wasn't a conflict of bullets, but of souls. The exact details of that meeting never fully came to light. Official records merely mention a morale incident and a review of leave policies on the USS Missouri. But it is known that after a tense negotiation, an agreement was reached. Leave would be reviewed and granted more fairly and frequently. Living conditions on board would be improved. There were no mass arrests or court-martials, although some of the ringleaders were discreetly reassigned to other ships months later, a subtle form of repression that stopped short of severe punishment. The Navy, in its wisdom, understood that the cost of exemplary punishment could be the total destruction of morale throughout the rest of the fleet. The USS Missouri continued her service, witnessing the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay. But for the men who lived through that April day in 1944, the mighty Mo would forever hold the echo of that defiant silence. It wasn't a glorious victory on the battlefield, but a victory of human will against oppression, a reminder that even in the most relentless machinery of war, the spirit of man can refuse to be broken. The story of the USS Missouri mutiny isn't told in textbooks, but it lives in the whispers of veterans, in the tired but proud gaze of those who were there. It is a testament that heroism is not always found in wartime action, but often in the stillness of a collective refusal, in the silent defense of one's own humanity. A reminder that even in war there is no victory without dignity,